Derek sits at his childhood dining table, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. His mother Carol slams down her wine glass, red liquid sloshing dangerously close to the edge. "We're not your bank anymore, Derek. Get out!" she screams, her face contorted with rage. His father Frank sits silently, avoiding eye contact. Just then, Derek's phone buzzes. A text from Scott, the family fund manager. Approve their $50K monthly allowance? The truth about his family's fortune suddenly crystallizes. Derek looks up, types "Denneed," and watches their faces fall. "I never thought I'd be 34 years old and living with my parents again. 6 months ago, I had a corner office on the 35th floor of the Baxter and Stone building in Manhattan. I was making well over six figures, had a sleek apartment in Tribeca, and was on track for a junior partnership. Then, the merger happened. We're restructuring the investment division," my boss had explained, his expression carefully neutral as he slid the severance package across his desk. "Your position has unfortunately been eliminated. At first, I wasn't worried. With my experience and track record, finding another position would be straightforward. At least that's what I thought. But after 4 months of interviews that went nowhere, and watching my savings dwindle paying Manhattan rent, reality hit hard. I needed to regroup. My parents had always lived in Westfield, Connecticut, in the same modest colonial house where I grew up. When I called to ask if I could stay with them temporarily while job hunting in the Connecticut financial sector, they seemed genuinely pleased. "Of course, sweetheart," my mother had said warmly. "Your room is always waiting for you." The first few weeks weren't bad. My parents welcomed me with home-cooked meals and supportive conversations about my job prospects. But something felt different about the house. Growing up, we were firmly middle class. My father worked as an engineering manager at a local manufacturing company, and my mother was an administrator at the high school. We always had what we needed, but were taught to be frugal. Luxuries were rare and carefully saved for. Now, walking through their house, I noticed subtle but significant changes. The kitchen had been completely renovated with high-end appliances and marble countertops. The living room featured furniture I didn't recognize, clearly expensive pieces. Even my old bedroom had been upgraded with a memory foam mattress and Egyptian cotton sheets. "We decided to treat ourselves a little after all those years of being careful," my father explained when I commented on the changes. "We deserve to enjoy our golden years." It made sense. They were both in their early 60s now, retired, and had worked hard all their lives. If they wanted to enjoy some comforts, who was I to question it? But then I stumbled across something strange. Looking for an old photo album in my father's home office, I found a folder of financial documents accidentally left out. I wasn't snooping intentionally, but the numbers caught my eye. Monthly expenses that totaled more than what I knew their combined pensions and Social Security could possibly cover. Credit card statements, showing regular charges at high-end retailers and restaurants. A receipt for a $25,000 watch. The math didn't add up. How were my middle-class parents suddenly living like this? A few days later, I overheard my mother on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in a hushed but irritated tone. "Yes, he's still here," she was saying. I know. It's cramping our lifestyle, too. Frank and I had plans to spend the winter in Palm Beach, but how can we, with Derek here? We'd have to explain everything." I quietly backed away, confused and a little hurt. What exactly would they need to explain? The next morning, I shared good news at breakfast. "I have an interview with Preston and Walsh next week," I told them, referring to a respected financial firm in Hartford. "Their compensation package looks solid, and they're expanding their investment division." Instead of the enthusiasm I expected, my mother frowned slightly. "Oh, Derek, are you sure that's the right move? Those financial jobs are so unstable, as you've seen. Maybe consider something different? Something less demanding?" My father nodded agreement. "There's no rush, son. You can stay here as long as you need. Maybe take some time to really think about what you want." Their reaction was puzzling. Throughout my childhood and college years, they'd pushed me to achieve, to be ambitious. Now they were suggesting I slow down? Take it easy? Their concern might have seemed parental if not for the conversation I'd overheard. That evening, while my parents were attending a charity gala, another new development, I did something I'd never done before. I searched their home office more thoroughly. In the back of their filing cabinet, I found bank statements showing multiple accounts I'd never known about. One account alone had a balance over $700,000. Where had all this money come from? My parents had been educators and mid-level managers all their lives. They'd always told me they had modest retirement savings. They'd made me work through college to pay for my own books and expenses, insisting it would teach me financial responsibility. Nothing made sense anymore, and I was beginning to suspect my parents weren't just enjoying a comfortable retirement. They were hiding something significant from me. Something that might explain why they seemed so reluctant to see me get back on my feet and leave. "Pass the potatoes, Derek," my sister Allison said, smiling across the dinner table. My parents had invited her and her husband Troy over for our usual monthly family dinner. Looking at my younger sister now, I realized how different our lives had become. Allison, 31 and radiantly confident, wore a designer dress that probably cost more than my entire remaining wardrobe. Her husband Troy, a dentist with a successful practice, sported a watch I recognized as a limited edition Rolex. They lived in a spacious house in the expensive part of Westfield and never seemed to worry about money. "We just closed on that property in Aspen," Allison announced as she served herself a generous portion of my mother's roast beef. "The ski-in, ski-out access is amazing, and the views are to die for." My father beamed with pride. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. We couldn't have done it without you and Mom," Allison added, reaching over to squeeze my mother's hand affectionately. I nearly choked on my wine. "You helped them buy a vacation property in Aspen?" The words came out before I could stop them. A moment of awkward silence followed. My mother recovered first, her smile tight. "We just helped with a little down payment. Nothing significant." "Speaking of property," Troy interjected smoothly. "How's the job search going, Derek? Any luck?" The conversation shifted, but my mind was racing. My parents had helped my sister buy a vacation home in one of the most expensive real estate markets in the country. Just a little down payment? The next day, I called my old college roommate Patrick, who now worked in real estate. "What would a down payment on a decent property in Aspen run these days?" I asked casually. "Minimum?" "Probably $300,000 for anything worthwhile," he replied. "But more likely $500,000 or more for something with ski-in, ski-out access." "Why? You coming into some money I don't know about?" After hanging up, I sat on my bed, stunned. If my parents had given Allison and Troy even the minimum Patrick mentioned, that was far from a little down payment. That was life-changing money. Money they'd never offered to me, even when I was struggling to make ends meet in New York. That evening, I found my mother alone in the kitchen and decided to broach the subject directly. "Mom, can I ask you something? Have you and Dad been helping Allison financially?" My mother's hand stilled on the dishcloth she was holding. "We've helped both our children when needed," she said carefully. "But not equally," I pressed. "You helped her with a down payment on her main house too, didn't you? And now a vacation property?" "Allison needed more help," my mother said, her tone turning defensive. "She and Troy have the twins to think about, and their lifestyle expectations are different. What about when I lost my job? When I was burning through my savings to stay afloat? Why didn't you offer to help me then?" My mother's expression hardened. "You've always been financially irresponsible, Derek. Spending on expensive restaurants and that ridiculous apartment in New York. We weren't going to enable that behavior." The accusation stung, especially because it wasn't true. Yes, my Manhattan apartment was expensive, but it was well within my salary range when I was employed. I'd consistently contributed to my 401k and had a solid investment portfolio before needing to liquidate it during my unemployment. "I worked my way through college," I reminded her, taking extra shifts at the campus bookstore while Allison had her entire education paid for, including that semester abroad in Paris. How was I the irresponsible one? "That's ancient history," my mother snapped, turning away. "And frankly, Derek, it's none of your business what your father and I do with our money." But was it really just their money? The question nagged at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about this situation felt deeply wrong. I began researching my family background more thoroughly, looking for answers. My maternal grandfather, William Anderson, had owned a manufacturing company in Hartford. He died when I was 10, and I had only vague memories of him. I remembered him as kind but serious, always asking about my grades and encouraging my interest in business. After his death, my parents rarely spoke about him or his business. I'd always assumed the company was small and had been sold off, with the proceeds modest enough to not significantly impact our middle-class lifestyle. But what if that assumption was wrong? The next morning, I drove to the Hartford Public Library and searched newspaper archives. There it was, in a business section from 24 years ago. Anderson Manufacturing, acquired by National Consolidated for $32 million. The article mentioned William Anderson had built the company from nothing into a regional powerhouse over 40 years. $32 million in the mid-90s would be worth considerably more today, especially if properly invested. Why had my parents continued to live as if they were middle class? Why make me work through college if there was family money available? And why were they now suddenly enjoying luxuries and helping Allison buy properties worth millions? I needed to speak with someone who knew the truth about my grandfather's estate. The article mentioned James Patterson as the attorney who handled the acquisition. A quick search showed he was still practicing law in Hartford, now in his 70s. I called his office and, mentioning I was William Anderson's grandson, secured an appointment for the following day. It was time to uncover what my parents had been hiding all these years. "I've been expecting one of William's grandchildren to come see me eventually," James Patterson said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied me across his desk. The law office was old-fashioned, with wood paneling and leather-bound books lining the walls. "I'm just surprised it took this long. To be honest, Mr. Patterson, I'm not even sure what questions to ask," I admitted. I recently discovered some discrepancies in what I thought I knew about my grandfather's business and estate. The elderly attorney nodded thoughtfully. "Your grandfather was an extraordinary man, Derek. Self-made in the truest sense. He built Anderson Manufacturing from a small workshop into a company that employed over 300 people. He pulled a thick file from his drawer, and he was meticulous about his legacy." For the next hour, James Patterson outlined the true extent of my grandfather's estate. The acquisition of his company had indeed brought in $32 million, but contrary to what I'd assumed, that money hadn't gone directly to my mother. "William established a family trust," Patterson explained. "Your mother Carol was named co-trustee, along with your father Frank, but only temporarily. The trust was specifically structured for equal distribution between Carol and her children." My heart was pounding. "Children? You mean Allison and me?" "Exactly. 1/3 to Carol, 1/3 to you, and 1/3 to Allison, with provisions that the children's portions be held in trust until you each turned 35, with your parents as trustees until that time." He peered at me over his glasses. "How old are you now, Derek?" 34, I replied automatically. "I'll be 35 in 2 weeks. A knowing look crossed the attorney's face. "That explains the timing of your visit, though you may not realize it." "What do you mean?" "Your grandfather's trust contained a specific clause. When you turn 35, control of your portion transfers automatically to you. Additionally, at that point, you have the right to audit how the trust has been managed since its inception." The implications hit me like a physical blow. My parents weren't just trustees of a modest family inheritance. They had been controlling a substantial fortune for over 20 years, a fortune partially meant for me. "The original trust was valued at $40 million after taxes and fees," Patterson continued. "Properly managed, it should be worth considerably more today." "And my parents were only supposed to be temporary trustees?" I asked, still processing this revelation. "Yes. Your grandfather was very clear. He wanted his grandchildren to have equal shares, but he wanted you to mature before taking control. 35 was the age he believed a person would have enough life experience to handle wealth responsibly." Patterson opened the file and removed a sealed envelope. "He also left this for you, to be given when you came asking questions." With slightly trembling hands, I took the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in a firm, clear hand. "Dear grandson," it began. "If you're reading this, you've started to question the family narrative about our wealth. Good. Critical thinking was always a quality I admired. The fortune I built was never meant to skip a generation or be hoarded by any one family member. It was meant to be shared equally and used to build, to create, to improve lives. Trust is important in families, but so is transparency. If anything seems amiss, remember, you have both the right and the responsibility to demand accountability. The Anderson legacy is as much yours to protect as anyone's. Your loving grandfather, William." I carefully refolded the letter, emotions churning inside me. Anger at my parents' deception, confusion about why they'd hidden this from me, and a growing suspicion about their recent efforts to discourage my career ambitions. "Is there any way my parents could prevent the transfer of control when I turned 35? I asked. Patterson's expression turned grave. "There are only a few provisions for delay. Proof of addiction, criminal activity, or mental incompetence could be grounds for continued guardianship. But they would need substantial evidence and a court order." A chill ran through me as I remembered how my mother had called me financially irresponsible despite evidence to the contrary. How my parents had discouraged me from pursuing new job opportunities. Was it possible they'd been actively working to maintain control of my inheritance? I thanked James Patterson and left with copies of the trust documents. On the drive home, pieces started falling into place. My parents hadn't just been hiding the family wealth from me. They'd been living off the trust, using money that was partially mine, while making me believe we were middle class. They'd given Allison access to her portion through gifts while making me work for everything. And now, with my 35th birthday approaching, they might be desperate to prevent me from taking control of what was rightfully mine. That evening, I found an old storage box in my closet containing mementos from high school and college. Among them was a business plan I'd created for an investment app during my senior year of college. I'd been excited about it, certain it had potential. I remembered showing it to my parents, seeking their advice and possibly a small loan to get started. "It's too risky," my father had said dismissively. "Focus on getting a steady job first. Entrepreneurship is a young man's game, and we don't have the kind of money to gamble on startups." But they did have that kind of money. My money, in part. Had they actively discouraged my ambitions to maintain control? Had they sabotaged other opportunities as well? I recalled the strangely lukewarm reference letter my father had written for a prestigious internship I'd applied for in college, which I ultimately didn't get. The way they'd discouraged me from accepting a job offer in San Francisco 5 years ago, citing distance and cost of living. Had those been genuine parental concerns? Or calculated moves to keep me dependent and in the dark? With my 35th birthday just 2 weeks away, I needed to act quickly. Tomorrow, I would confront my parents with what I'd learned. But first, I needed to make copies of all the documents and store them somewhere safe. Because if my suspicions were correct, my parents wouldn't give up control of millions of dollars without a fight. The atmosphere in my parents' house had changed dramatically. Where there had been mild disapproval of my job searching, there was now open hostility. My mother hardly spoke to me except to make passive-aggressive comments about my extended stay. My father, always the more passive of the two, simply avoided me. After my meeting with Patterson, I decided not to immediately confront them. Instead, I called my old friend from law school, Jack Thompson, who now worked at a firm specializing in trust and estate law. "This is serious, Derek," Jack said after I explained the situation over coffee at a cafe far from my parents' neighborhood. "If what Patterson told you is accurate, your parents have been abusing their fiduciary duty for decades." "I need to know exactly what they've done with the money," I replied. "Before I turn 35. Jack nodded thoughtfully. "I can help you prepare legal documentation to request a full accounting of the trust. But given what you've told me, we should be prepared for resistance. They might try to file for an extension of their trusteeship. On what grounds? As Patterson mentioned, they could attempt to prove you're financially incompetent or otherwise unfit to manage your inheritance." Jack's expression was serious. Have you noticed any unusual behavior that might suggest they're building a case against you? I thought about it. They've been discouraging me from taking job interviews. And my mother has made comments about me being financially irresponsible, which isn't true. They might be documenting your period of unemployment and return to their home as evidence of financial instability, Jack suggested. I've seen similar tactics in trust disputes. Armed with Jack's advice, I began my own investigation. While my parents were at their country club one afternoon, I carefully searched their home office again. In a locked drawer, I was able to open with a letter opener. I found disturbing evidence of their plans. There were draft legal documents for a petition to extend their trusteeship over my portion of the inheritance, citing patterns of financial instability and poor judgment. They'd been collecting evidence. Notes about my job loss, credit card statements. They'd somehow obtained showing normal expenses they'd characterized as lavish. Even printouts of social media posts showing me at restaurants or events they deemed extravagant. More alarmingly, I found correspondence with another attorney about potentially modifying the trust documents through a technique called decanting that might allow them to change some terms of my grandfather's original trust. But the most shocking discovery was evidence that they had been systematically liquidating certain trust assets, particularly over the past year. This went beyond mere control. They were actively moving money around in ways that seemed designed to obscure its whereabouts. I needed more information from someone who understood the family finances. The trust documents mentioned a financial manager named Scott Williams who worked at Hartford Trust Bank. I decided to reach out to him directly. Mr. Williams? This is Derek Anderson. I believe you manage my family's trust? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Yes, I do. I'm surprised to hear from you directly. I'd like to meet with you to discuss the trust, particularly some recent transactions I've become aware of. Another pause, longer this time. I'm not sure your parents would approve of that meeting. I'm turning 35 in 12 days, I replied firmly. At that point, I'll have legal control over my portion regardless of their approval. I'd prefer to understand the situation before then. Scott agreed to meet me privately, away from the bank. He suggested a coffee shop in a neighboring town, which immediately raised my suspicions. Why the secrecy? The financial manager turned out to be younger than I expected, perhaps early 40s, with an anxious demeanor. I've been uncomfortable with some of the directions I've received lately, he admitted after I showed him copies of the trust documents Patterson had given me. Your parents have been making unusual requests. What kind of requests? Scott hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Large transfers to offshore accounts, liquidation of long-held positions, and significantly increased distributions to themselves. How much are they taking? They receive a monthly allowance of $50,000 from the trust. That's separate from regular distributions, for major expenses and gifts to your sister. The amount was staggering. $50,000 monthly, just as an allowance, more than many families earned in a year. While I had been scrimping to make my severance package last, worrying about draining my savings, my parents had been receiving this enormous sum every month, partly from what should have been my inheritance. And they've never distributed any to me, I stated, already knowing the answer. No. There have been distributions coded for education early on, but nothing directly to you in many years. Scott looked uncomfortable. There's something else you should know. They recently attempted to transfer $3 million to an account in the Cayman Islands. I delayed it by requesting additional documentation, but they're pushing hard. Can you block it entirely? He shook his head. Not without cause. But... He hesitated. The trust does require my signature for major changes. That's a protection your grandfather built in. The bank serves as a co-trustee for certain actions. This was crucial information. So they can't completely empty the trust without your approval? Correct. And I've been keeping detailed records of all transactions, especially the questionable ones. Scott lowered his voice. Between us, I've been concerned enough that I've documented everything meticulously. If there's ever an investigation, I want it clear that I raised appropriate concerns. Before leaving, I asked Scott one more question. What's the current value of the trust, if managed properly all these years. Approximately $70 million, divided into the 3 shares your grandfather specified. I nearly fell out of my chair. $70 million. And my share, just over $23 million, had been kept from me while I'd struggled financially. The magnitude of my parents' betrayal was almost incomprehensible. That evening, I received a text from my mother. "Family dinner tomorrow night. We need to discuss your future plans. 7 p.m. sharp." The tone was friendly enough, but after everything I'd learned, it felt ominous. I called Jack immediately. "They might be planning something," I told him. "Patterson mentioned they'd need evidence of incompetence to maintain control past my birthday. What if they're setting me up somehow?" "Be extremely careful," Jack warned. "Record everything if legal in your state. Don't sign anything. Don't make any statements that could be misconstrued. And secure all your evidence somewhere they can't access it." I spent that night copying every document I'd found and sending digital backups to both Jack and a secure email account only I could access. I placed the originals in a safety deposit box at a different bank from the one my parents used. Whatever they were planning for tomorrow's dinner, I would be prepared. I also took one additional precaution. I contacted the trust bank and, using the information from the trust documents, placed a temporary freeze pending investigation for unusual activity. It wouldn't stop regular operations, but it would prevent large transfers like the one Scott had mentioned. As I prepared for what I knew would be a confrontational dinner, I felt a strange calm. For years I'd been operating under false assumptions about my family and my own financial situation. Now, with the truth finally coming to light, I was ready to take control not just of my inheritance, but of my future. The dining room gleamed under the chandelier's light, crystal and silver shining on the elegant table setting. My mother had prepared her signature beef Wellington, a dish normally reserved for special occasions. The expensive bottle of Cabernet had been opened to breathe. Everything suggested a celebration rather than the confrontation I knew was coming. "You've gone all out," I commented, taking my seat at the table. "What's the occasion?" "Can't a mother do something nice for her son?" My mother's smile didn't reach her eyes as she served the perfectly cooked meat. My father busied himself with pouring wine, avoiding direct eye contact. We ate in relative silence for several minutes, the tension building with each passing moment. Finally, my mother dabbed her lips with her napkin and placed her hands flat on the table. "Derek, your father and I have been discussing your situation." Her voice was carefully modulated, as if she'd rehearsed this speech. "We're concerned about your future." "My future?" I kept my tone neutral, following Jack's advice to reveal nothing. "Yes. It's been 6 months since you lost your position, and while we understand the job market can be challenging, we wonder if perhaps your expectations might be too high." My father finally spoke up. "What your mother is trying to say, son, is that sometimes we need to accept that our career paths may take unexpected turns. Perhaps the high-pressure financial world isn't where your talents lie." I took a sip of wine, considering my response. "I have an interview next week that looks promising. A senior analyst position at Gramercy Partners." My mother's smile tightened. "Oh, Derek. Another investment firm? After what happened at Baxter and Stone? Wouldn't something more stable be appropriate? Perhaps government work? Or teaching?" The pattern was unmistakable now. They were actively trying to steer me away from financial independence and success. "I've always excelled in finance," I replied calmly. "My termination was due to a merger, not performance issues." "Nevertheless," my father interjected, "we think it might be time for a more serious conversation about your future, particularly your financial future." Here it was, the opening I'd been waiting for. I've actually been thinking a lot about my financial future lately, especially with my 35th birthday approaching. The brief flicker of alarm in my mother's eyes confirmed my suspicions. They knew exactly what that birthday meant for control of the trust. "Yes. Well, about that," my father continued, suddenly very interested in cutting his meat. "Your mother and I have been consulting with some experts about your situation." "What kind of experts?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Financial advisors," my mother said smoothly. "And some legal counsel. Given your recent difficulties, we've been advised that it might be in your best interest if we continue to oversee certain aspects of your financial affairs for a bit longer. You mean the family trust? I asked directly. The one grandfather established that gives me control of my portion when I turn 35? The silence that followed was deafening. My parents exchanged glances, clearly thrown by my direct acknowledgement of the trust they'd hidden from me for decades. My father recovered first. So you know about that. I do now. Though I'm curious why I had to find out from James Patterson rather than from you. James Patterson? My mother's voice rose slightly. You went to your grandfather's attorney behind our backs? Just as you've been hiding my inheritance behind mine for 24 years, I countered. Why didn't you tell me about the trust? About the $40 million that grandfather left specifically to be divided between you, me, and Allison? My father sighed heavily. We were protecting you, Derek. Money changes people. We wanted you to develop a strong work ethic, to make your own way, while simultaneously giving Allison access to her portion through gifts, while taking a $50,000 monthly allowance for yourselves. That doesn't sound like protection. It sounds like control. And theft. My mother's composure cracked. How dare you? We've given you everything. A good home, an education. An education I worked my way through, I reminded her, while living in the cheapest campus housing available. Meanwhile, you were sitting on millions that were partially mine. We filed paperwork, my father said abruptly, his tone hardening. Legal documents attesting to your financial incompetence. The job loss, moving back home, your history of expensive tastes. The trust will remain under our management. So there it was, the threat I'd been expecting. On what grounds exactly? I lost a job during a company merger, like thousands of others. I made a prudent decision to reduce expenses while job hunting. My financial records show consistent saving and investing when I was employed. No court would find me incompetent based on that. We'll see, my mother said coldly. We have very good attorneys. Attorneys paid with trust money, I noted. My money in part. I wonder what a judge would make of that conflict of interest. You've always been so ungrateful. My mother's voice rose sharply. Everything we've done has been for this family. For this family? Or for yourselves? I challenged. The offshore accounts? The manipulated trust documents? The systematic campaign to keep me financially dependent and in the dark? That doesn't sound like family protection to me. My mother's face contorted with rage. She slammed her wineglass down, red wine sloshing dangerously close to the edge. We're not your bank anymore, Derek. Get out! She screamed. My father sat silently, avoiding eye contact, neither defending me nor calming my mother. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text. I glanced down to see a message from Scott Williams. Urgent. Your parents attempting to override freeze. Approve their $50K monthly allowance? The timing was perfect, almost theatrical in its impact. I looked up from my phone to my parents' faces, now watching me with sudden wariness. That wouldn't happen to be Scott, would it? My mother asked, her voice suddenly cautious. It is, I replied calmly. He's asking about your monthly allowance, the one you take from the trust. My trust, in part. I held my phone where they could see it, and deliberately typed a one-word response. Denied. The effect was immediate. My mother's face drained of color. My father's hand, reaching for his wineglass, froze midair. You can't do that, my father said, his voice uncertain. Actually, I can. I've spoken with the bank. As a beneficiary, I have the right to question suspicious transactions and request a freeze pending investigation, which is exactly what I've done. This is outrageous. My mother stood up, napkin falling forgotten to the floor. After everything we've done for you, what exactly have you done for me? I asked quietly. Lied about my inheritance? Used my money while making me work for every penny? Actively undermined my career to keep me dependent? Planned to legally declare me incompetent to maintain control of what is rightfully mine? I stood up, placing my napkin neatly beside my plate. I'm not the irresponsible one here. You are. And in 12 days, when I turn 35, I'll have full legal control of my portion regardless of your schemes. The question now is whether I pursue a full investigation of how you've managed the trust for the past 24 years. That's a question you might want to consider carefully before our next conversation. With that, I walked out of the dining room, leaving my stunned parents behind. In my pocket, my phone buzzed again with Scott's response. Transaction blocked. We need to talk tomorrow. Many irregular activities to review. As I packed an overnight bag in my room, I felt strangely unburdened. The truth, however painful, was finally out in the open, and with it came a clarity I hadn't felt in months, perhaps even years. You can stay here as long as you need, Jack said, showing me to his guest room. His apartment in downtown Hartford was spacious and comfortable, the complete opposite of the tense atmosphere I'd left behind. Thanks, I appreciate it. I set down my bag, mentally cataloging my next steps. I need to meet with Scott Williams tomorrow, and I should probably talk to Allison at some point. Jack nodded. Your sister might be a valuable ally, if she doesn't know the full story either. The next morning, I met Scott at Hartford Trust Bank, this time officially. The temporary freeze I'd placed on the trust had apparently caused quite a stir, with several executives now involved in reviewing the account activity. I should have raised concerns sooner, Scott admitted, as we sat in a conference room with the bank's trust department head. But your parents were the legal trustees, and they always had explanations for the unusual transactions. Let's focus on what happens now. The department head, a stern woman named Barbara Winters, interjected. Our preliminary review shows numerous questionable transfers and distributions that may constitute breach of fiduciary duty. Scott opened his laptop and turned it toward me. I've maintained separate records of all transactions. Here's what I've found particularly concerning. For the next 2 hours, we went through detailed financial records showing how my parents had managed the trust. While they hadn't completely depleted it, many of the investments had actually performed well. They had consistently taken far more for themselves than the trust intended. Expensive renovations to their home, luxury cars, lavish vacations, and gifts to Allison that circumvented the equal distribution requirement. What about these offshore transfers? I asked, pointing to a series of transactions to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Scott looked uncomfortable. Those started about 5 years ago. Relatively small amounts at first, but increasing over time. The most recent attempt was for $3 million. Can we trace where that money went? We're working on it, Barbara said. But offshore accounts are designed to be difficult to track. We've engaged our fraud department to assist. By the end of the meeting, I had a much clearer picture of what had happened. My parents hadn't completely looted the trust. It was still worth approximately $68 million, slightly less than it should have been but substantial nonetheless. However, they had systematically abused their position as trustees, taking far more than their fair share, and actively working to prevent me from receiving my portion. What are my options? I asked Barbara. You have several, she replied. In 12 days, you automatically gain control of your portion, approximately $22 million at current valuation. You could simply wait for that to happen and move forward. Or you could pursue legal action for breach of fiduciary duty, which might recover some of the misappropriated funds but would likely be costly and time-consuming. And potentially very public, Scott added. I thanked them both, and left with copies of all the financial records. My next stop was a meeting with Jack and his colleague who specialized in trust litigation. Based on what you've shown us, you have a strong case for breach of fiduciary duty, the trust attorney confirmed. Your parents clearly violated their responsibilities as trustees. What would that process look like? I asked. Lengthy, expensive, and frankly, ugly, she replied honestly. Family trust disputes are among the most acrimonious cases we handle. And there's the publicity to consider. Jack nodded in agreement. The question is what outcome you're looking for, Derek. Do you want justice, or do you want peace? Sometimes you can't have both. It was a profound question, one I needed time to consider. In the midst of my deliberations, I received a text from Allison. We need to talk. What's going on with Mom and Dad? They're freaking out. I agreed to meet her at a cafe the next day, unsure how much she knew or whose side she might take in this family drama. When I arrived, she was already seated, looking worried and confused. "Mom called me crying last night," she began without preamble. "Something about you freezing accounts and making accusations. What's happening, Derek? Did you know about grandfather's trust?" I asked directly. Her hesitation told me everything. "Yes," she finally admitted. "Mom and Dad told me about it when I turned 25. They said it was a family secret, that the money was being carefully managed for our future." "And did they tell you it was supposed to be divided equally between you, me, and Mom? That we were each entitled to 1/3? Allison shifted uncomfortably. "They said there was a family trust, but that they had discretion over distributions. That they were making sure the money was used wisely." I pulled out copies of the trust documents and slid them across the table. "Read this. The actual terms of grandfather's trust." As Allison read, her expression changed from confusion to shock. "This says, we each get equal portions, and you're supposed to get control of your share when you turn 35. She looked up, realization dawning. "Which is soon." In 11 days, I confirmed. "They never told me about the trust at all. I had to discover it myself. Meanwhile, they've been giving you gifts from your portion while making me believe the family had modest means." "The down payment on our house," Allison said quietly. "The Aspen property. Those came from the trust?" "Yes. Your share of it, technically. Which is fine, that's what it was intended for. But they gave you access, while completely hiding my portion from me." "I had no idea they hadn't told you," Allison insisted, looking genuinely distressed. "They always said you were focused on your career, that you weren't interested in family financial discussions." "That's not true. They actively discouraged my career moves that would have made me more financially independent." I hesitated, then decided she needed to know everything. "There's more. They've been moving money to offshore accounts, and they filed paperwork trying to declare me financially incompetent to prevent me from taking control of my share." "What?" Allison looked stunned. "That's insane. You're the most financially responsible person I know. I've frozen the accounts temporarily to prevent further transfers. That's what triggered their panic." Allison was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. "What are you going to do? Sue them?" "I'm considering my options. But first, I wanted you to know the truth." My sister reached across the table and grabbed my hand. "I'm so sorry, Derek. I had no idea. What can I do to help?" Her immediate support was unexpected and deeply moving. I'd worried she might side with our parents, given the preferential treatment she'd received over the years. "Would you be willing to sign an affidavit confirming they told you about the trust but not me, and detailing the financial gifts they've given you? It would help establish a pattern of unequal treatment." "Absolutely," she said, without hesitation. "And I want to be clear, I'm not okay with how they've treated you. This isn't fair. It's not what grandfather wanted." With Allison now aligned with me, I felt more confident moving forward. We spent the next several hours discussing our parents' behavior over the years, identifying patterns neither of us had fully recognized before. The subtle undermining of my confidence. The way they'd positioned Allison as the successful child despite my objectively more accomplished career. The constant messaging that I was somehow less capable of managing money, despite evidence to the contrary. It was all about control, Allison realized. They didn't want to give up control of the money, and you were the threat because your birthday would trigger the automatic transfer. Exactly. As we parted, Allison hugged me tightly. "Whatever you decide to do, I'm with you. This isn't right, and they need to face that." The next day, I met again with Jack and the bank representatives to finalize my strategy. We'd just concluded our meeting when my phone buzzed with another text from Scott Williams. "Your parents trying again to access monthly allowance. Override freeze? $50K transfer. Pending approval." This was the crucial moment, the one that had started at that fateful dinner. With Allison's support, the bank's documentation, and the legal clarity about my rights, I now had all the leverage I needed. I typed my response, the same one I'd given at the dinner table. "Denied." Then I added, "Schedule all interested parties for meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m., at grandfather's old office in the Anderson building. Full accounting will be presented. All further allowance requests on hold pending resolution." It was time to end this once and for all. The conference room in the Anderson Manufacturing Building hadn't changed much since my childhood visits with my grandfather. The company had been sold decades ago, but the building still bore our family name, and several offices were still leased to businesses with connections to my grandfather. I'd arranged to use his old corner office for this crucial meeting, finding a poetic symmetry in confronting my parents in the space where my grandfather had built the fortune they'd mismanaged. At precisely 10 o'clock, the participants began arriving. First came Scott Williams and Barbara Winters from the bank, carrying folders of financial documentation. Jack arrived next with another attorney from his firm. Allison came alone, having told Troy she needed to handle this family matter herself. My parents were the last to arrive, looking simultaneously angry and apprehensive as they entered the room where my grandfather had once presided over his business empire. "What is the meaning of this?" my mother demanded, seeing the assembled group. "Some kind of ambush?" "Not an ambush," I replied calmly. "A reckoning." I asked everyone to be seated at the large conference table. At the head of the table, I remained standing, a position of authority my grandfather had often adopted during important meetings. "We're here today to address the management of the Anderson Family Trust, established by William Anderson 24 years ago," I began formally. "Present are the trustees, beneficiaries, and financial and legal representatives with interest in the matter." My father started to interrupt, but I held up my hand. "You'll have your chance to speak. But first, we need to establish the facts." For the next 30 minutes, Scott Williams presented a detailed accounting of the trust's management over the past 24 years. The documentation was damning. Excessive distributions to my parents, unequal treatment of beneficiaries, questionable investments that primarily benefited my parents' friends' businesses, and the recent attempts to transfer substantial sums offshore. Throughout the presentation, my parents' expressions shifted from defiance to discomfort to something approaching fear. When Scott finished, the room was silent for a long moment. "Before we hear from anyone else," I said, "I want to address one critical question." I turned to face my parents directly. Why? Why hide this from me for my entire adult life? Why actively undermine my financial independence? Why violate grandfather's explicit wishes? My parents exchanged glances. Finally, my father spoke, his voice subdued. "It started with good intentions. We truly did want you both to develop a work ethic, to not rely on family money. But then it became about control," my mother admitted, surprising everyone with her candor. "The more time passed, the harder it became to tell the truth. And yes, we grew accustomed to a certain lifestyle. The thought of giving up control of 2/3 of the assets was frightening. We didn't want to lose our status," my father added quietly. "After living modestly for so many years, finally enjoying wealth in our later years, the prospect of scaling back was unthinkable." "So you lied to me my entire life," I stated. "Made me believe we were middle class while sitting on millions that were partially mine." "We convinced ourselves it was for your own good," my mother said, though the excuse sounded hollow even to her own ears. "That you weren't ready. And the recent attempts to have me declared incompetent? The offshore accounts? Were those for my own good too? Neither of them could meet my eyes." "Here's what's going to happen," I said, placing a document on the table. "This is a restructuring plan for the family trust, effective immediately. It honors grandfather's original intentions, while addressing the current reality." I outlined the key points. My portion would be immediately separated into a new trust under my sole control. Allison's portion would similarly be placed under her control, with professional advisory services provided by the bank. My parents would retain control of their 1/3 share, but with increased oversight from the bank's trust department. The offshore accounts would be repatriated, with those funds divided according to the original three-way split. "Additionally," I continued, "you will receive a monthly allowance of $15,000 from your portion of the trust. That's still more than most Americans earn, but considerably less than the $50,000 you've been taking." "That's outrageous," my mother protested. "We can't possibly live on that amount." "You managed to live on far less while I was growing up," I reminded her. And you're free to work if you need additional income, just as you expected me to do. You can't do this, my father insisted. We're the trustees. Not anymore, Barbara Winters interjected. The bank has fiduciary responsibility here. Given the documented irregularities, we're obligated to ensure proper management going forward. Mr. Anderson's proposal is actually quite generous, considering the circumstances. He could pursue criminal charges for breach of fiduciary duty. My parents paled at the mention of criminal charges. That's not my intention, I assured them, and I could see relief wash over their faces. Despite everything, you're still my parents. I don't want to see you humiliated or punished. I just want what's rightfully mine, what grandfather intended me to have. Allison spoke up for the first time. Mom, Dad, this is more than fair. Derek could demand repayment of everything you've taken beyond your fair share. He's not doing that. He's just asking for the structure grandfather created to be honored. Slowly, reluctantly, my parents nodded their agreement. The bank representatives presented the necessary documents, which everyone signed. Within an hour, the restructuring was officially in progress. As the meeting concluded, my parents approached me hesitantly. What now? My father asked. Where do we go from here as a family? It was a profound question, one I'd been wrestling with since discovering their deception. That's up to you, I replied honestly. I'm willing to work toward reconciliation, but it will take time and complete transparency from now on. We understand, my mother said, looking genuinely remorseful for perhaps the first time. We've made terrible mistakes, unforgivable ones. Not unforgivable, I corrected her. Difficult to forgive, yes, but not impossible. In the months that followed, our family began a slow healing process. With the financial issues resolved, we could finally address the deeper wounds, the breach of trust, the years of manipulation, the fundamental dishonesty that had characterized our relationship for so long. We began seeing a family therapist specializing in wealth dynamics, a field I hadn't even known existed. Through those sessions, my parents gradually confronted their unhealthy attachment to money and status. I worked through my anger and sense of betrayal. Allison dealt with her guilt over receiving preferential treatment. With my portion of the trust now under my control, I established a balanced approach to wealth management. I returned to work, not because I needed to financially, but because I valued the sense of purpose and achievement. I joined the board of a local community foundation, honoring my grandfather's belief in giving back, and I began cautiously exploring entrepreneurial opportunities, including that investment app idea I'd abandoned years ago. 6 months after that confrontational meeting, we gathered for another family dinner. This time, the setting was my new home, a comfortable but not ostentatious house I'd purchased near Hartford. The atmosphere couldn't have been more different from that fateful night when my mother had screamed for me to get out. As we sat around my dining table, sharing a meal I'd prepared myself, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in years. My parents spoke about their adjustments to their new financial reality, finding, somewhat to their surprise, that $15,000 monthly was indeed enough when they weren't trying to maintain appearances. We've actually started volunteering at the community center, my father shared. It's been grounding. And we're talking about teaching financial literacy at the high school, my mother added, using our mistakes as lessons for others. Allison raised her glass. To Grandfather William, she said, for his wisdom in creating a legacy that eventually brought us to honesty, even if it took a while. We all drank to that toast, the symbolism not lost on anyone. Later, as my parents prepared to leave, my mother hugged me tightly. I'm sorry, she whispered, for everything. I hope someday you can truly forgive us. I'm working on it, I replied honestly. We all are. As I closed the door behind them, I reflected on the journey of the past year. From successful investment banker to unemployed and dependent, to discovering a hidden fortune and family deception, to finally establishing a new equilibrium based on truth rather than manipulation. It hadn't been easy, and the road to complete family healing remained long. But the foundation was now solid. My grandfather's letter had mentioned both rights and responsibilities. The right to demand accountability, yes, but also the responsibility to use wealth wisely, to protect the family legacy not just financially but ethically. That was the true inheritance he'd left me, one I was only now beginning to fully appreciate. The path forward wasn't about the money itself, but about the values it represented. Honesty, fairness, integrity, standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. These were the principles that would guide me now, in business, in family relationships, and in life. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't giving people what they want, but holding them accountable for their actions. My parents were finally facing the consequences of their choices, and paradoxically, it had freed them to become better versions of themselves. As for me, I discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The ability to confront difficult truths, to stand firm in the face of manipulation, and ultimately, to offer a path to redemption rather than simply punishment. That strength would serve me well in whatever challenges lay ahead. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who were treating you unfairly? It's one of the hardest things we can face in life, but sometimes it's necessary for everyone's growth. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment sharing your experience. And if you found value in this journey of confronting difficult truths and finding a path to healing, please like this video, subscribe to the channel for more stories of transformation, and share with someone who might need to hear this message of standing up for what's right. Thank you for joining me on this deeply personal journey, and I wish you courage in facing your own difficult conversations.